issue of mandatory sharing of sports broadcasts and measures to promote competition. Please join me in welcoming on stage Mr. Venkatesh, who is the man spearheading strategy at DSport in India. Mr. Mihir Rale from Star India Private Limited, Senior Vice President. Dr. Dasgupta is already on stage. Mr. Sidharth Chopra, who is a partner at Saikrishna, and the moderator, Harveen Ahluwalia from the Kent.
Good morning, everyone. I apologize in advance for my throat. I'm under the weather, but that's quite a turnout for a Saturday morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I welcome all the panelists. It's a fantastic mix of everyone who's taken out the time to be here. It's lovely. And the topic which we are going to share today with all of us, we're going to talk about is mandatory sharing of sports feeds with public broadcasters. Going by the first panel, I think it's the hottest topic there is in broadcasting regulation. So, and there has been a lot of confusion on what to share and what not to. We go by the definition of what sport is of national importance. And to start with, I'd like to know from each of you, coming from your respective backgrounds, on what your definitions are of what a nationally important sport is. So, let's start.
Thank you. Now it's a very interesting question of what a nationally important sport is. There is a list which is drawn up by the ministry when they first put out the sharing regulations, and that includes tournaments like the Indira Gandhi Gold Cup, which hasn't been held for the last 17 years. So it is something which is an anachronism, I would say, this whole concept of mandatory sharing. It has its roots in what is called an anti-siphoning law, which is there in many countries globally. And that is to prevent price gouging by broadcasters who own strong assets. Now, in a country like India, the situation is completely different. You have a very highly regulated broadcast industry where there's effective competition at the front end. And there isn't much scope for any sort of price gouging. Even if there were, then the mandatory sharing concept doesn't exist anywhere in the world except in India. There is an anti-siphoning law which makes it incumbent on the rights holders to make sure that the rights are offered to multiple parties. Now here you put the onus on one party to spend a huge amount of money to buy the rights and then force them to share the content, which is very unique as far as India is concerned. And if you go back to the time when this whole thing was actually enunciated way back in 2005 or 6, I don't remember, India was largely a terrestrial dominated distribution system. Cable was still in infancy. About 25% or 30% of homes are covered by cable. The rest were terrestrial broadcast. So there was an argument that there was a large chunk of the population which wasn't getting access to popular cultural assets or sports events through the private networks. Today it's not the case. I mean, terrestrial broadcast is barely 10%, if at all. So I think this is an anachronism. It needs to be done away with. It has actually no relevance in today's distribution system and the way that things are.
Yeah, building on that, we had the Sam Pitroda committee report which said that terrestrial is down to 8%, and that was 4 years ago. I'm sure it has come down further. So in that sense, has the law lived up to its relevance and has it lived up to what it's set out for? Are we actually looking at public interest still, or is it just the public broadcaster whose interests are we taking care of through this law?
Okay, so before we jump into it, if you don't mind, can I give a quick background to what the law is and what happened vis-a-vis the Supreme Court recently?
Sure.
So, I mean, very quickly off the top of my head, I'm just relating from the short title to the act. But it was an act to provide access to the largest number of listeners and viewers on a free-to-air basis through mandatory sharing of signals to sporting events of national importance. Broadly, that was it. So, 2 or 3 key things from it. One, it was to provide access to a set of listeners and viewers who did not have access. 2, it was supposed to be on a free-to-air basis. 3, it was through mandatory sharing. When you say mandatory sharing, it brings a connotation of compulsiveness or a compulsion. So essentially, what was being mandatorily taken away? It was mandatory sharing of live signals. Signals in this context is copyright, it's intellectual property. So if you draw a parallel, it's like land acquisition almost. So in that space. And 2 sporting events of national importance. So when we say national importance, I think we have to give some kind of weight to the term national importance. Is popularity the right metric for it? I'm not sure when it comes to national importance. So that was the background. How was this mandate or objective achieved? It was achieved through saying that you have to give live signals, you have to share your live signals with Prasar Bharati for them to make it available on All India Radio, that's the viewer part of it, and for them to make it available through their terrestrial network and on their free dish, which is their DTH network. What used to happen till some time back was that there was a separate statute through which all DD channels were supposed to be shown by all cable and satellite operators on a compulsory basis. So while this mandatory sharing act was used to take the particular signal, the other act was used to actually make that content available to the entire television watching audience. That was, I think, the biggest grievance for anyone coming from a sports broadcasting background. Having invested so much to have his own content essentially compete on a free basis. There's no competition there. I think what the Supreme Court has done has gone a long way in terms of setting in place what should be the law and how it should be interpreted. That being said, I think as we move along, your question was whether it's become more a question of helping the public service broadcaster more than sports broadcasting itself. I think 2 things to that, and maybe we'll come back to it when we come to the questions of what should we revisit in mandatory sharing. But 2 things to it. I think 1, the list of national events or events of national importance which are notified today. There's no intelligible criteria. I don't think there is any lens which is being applied. And if at all a lens is being applied, it's actually popularity. To me, popularity is absolutely the wrong metric to use for calling something of national importance. I mean, to give a very loose example, WWE could be, without any offense to anyone, WWE could be popular, right? Does it make it of national importance? I would think not. So in terms of how it's being implemented and how the public sector broadcaster is actually utilizing this content, I would think potentially it's being used only to fill availability on Doordarshan channels. I think the events of national importance are too vast and too ubiquitous to actually make it sort of fitting of that national importance tag. So to that extent, I think there are a few areas which I think we'll talk about in the later part of the session to talk about what I think we should revisit in terms of the Mandatory Sharing Act.
I'll first answer. You said, do we have an explanation for what is event of national importance? No. The statute does not give any guidance to what is event of national importance. But having been involved in this mandatory sharing litigation for past 6 years and having gone through the Prasar Bharati stated position on affidavit, for them, the only event of national importance are T20 matches and one-day matches. They do not intend to show test matches at all. They have said on an affidavit that we make losses when we show test matches. They carried Commonwealth Games on another new channel created so that they do not disturb their routine transmission of program on Doordarshan. While the purpose of the statute was very laudable, but the implementation of Prasar Bharati was that it was only utilized to show T20 and one-day matches. And when it showed T20 and one-day matches, there have been occasions that the TRPs of Prasar Bharati has been even greater than that of the official broadcaster. And how the mandatory sharing implementation before the Supreme Court judgment came, what it was doing is the Star's content on its own channel was competing with Star's content on Prasar Bharati's platform, which by virtue of another act, it was made available to the entire television viewing universe. So it was a unique position. Prasar Bharati was being subsidized by a private broadcaster. Prasar Bharati, without having acquired the rights, enjoyed all the rights which otherwise a broadcaster used to bid and get. In 2012, it took 10 years, in 2017, it took 10 years for the Supreme Court to lay down that the law is unambiguous. The Prasar Bharati Act came in 2007, and in 2017 we had the final judgment saying that all that the Prasar Bharati Act allowed, mandatory sharing act allowed Prasar Bharati was to share the feed only on its DTH and terrestrial platform. Now if I come to the second question, is the act relevant? In my view, it is very relevant. Yes, we have to have that act because that act was to provide access to people who otherwise did not have access, A, because of the financial means, or B, because of the remote areas in which there was no cable connection, there was no connectivity. So act has relevance. Supreme Court in two judgments has said that the act has relevance, but to provide access, not substitute access to those who otherwise had. The limited short point which we made before Supreme Court was the act was only to provide access to people who otherwise did not have access. However, by actions of Prasar Bharati, access was substituted for the entire television viewing universe. And finally, it took one cycle for Star rights to exhaust, for the law to be clearly laid down. Since 2007 to 2017, the figures which was there, the sports broadcaster did not make any money by virtue of, since this act was enacted in 2017. So that was the reality. Having said that, I still maintain the act is very relevant. We need to have that act is to provide to those members of the public who do not have access. So these are
the first question regarding the national importance. Now, clearly that is a term which itself is ambiguous. What is national importance and what is not will change depending upon the kind of society that you are living in. So today, at one point of time, for example, hockey would be regarded as of national importance if you go by the viewership and popularity. And now, you would be vouching for cricket and probably 10 years down the line, kabaddi, probably 10 years down the line. I mean, it's such an ambiguous term. So I think we can deal with it on a case-to-case basis because it would not be legislatively possible to define, and that's my position, to define what is of national importance. The other point is that if you have to define national importance, do you define it not in terms of, fine, don't define it in terms of popularity, then what do you define it in terms of? You cannot define it in terms of national security possibly, right? Because it's sports that we are talking about. Then how do you define the word national importance? Then do you do an empirical survey and see how many people consider a sport to be something of great importance? So which is an useless exercise. I think we can keep it aside. The other thing is, if I may add, that in this world that we're existing, we do have different models of regulation of sports broadcasting. Indian model is probably one of the most stringent, apart from the Australian model. But we do have a EU model. We do have, if you have to break it down to specifics, we do have the UK model. And we can also think of the US model or the South African model. So it's not that, India doesn't have a reference point to look at and kind of refine and fine-tune what it is doing currently.
So I want to come back to this later, that what do we need to do here?
I got your point. Revisiting.
To redefine.
Right.
So before that, I want to know how close is India when it comes to mandatory sharing. You said that there's no such law like that anywhere else. So what happens in other countries? How close are we in terms of law and in terms of legal relevance when it comes to mandatory sharing with other countries?
Right. Now, one thing one has to be clear on is that our purpose of mandatory sharing appears to be on the face of it, though the objective defined is to allow access, as was said, to people who otherwise wouldn't have access. But the way it is being done, and with the Supreme Court decision, it appears to be more clearer. The way it appears to be done is that it is more to subsidize the public sector broadcaster, that is Prasar Bharati, than to aim at kind of giving access to the ones who don't have access. So in that context, we need to revisit the model that we are currently following and think of a model which might be a more balanced approach, which does not eat into the revenues probably of the private broadcaster, but also serves the whole aspect or task of giving access to the inaccessible. And that is where we need to look into.
I think we all agree on this that the purpose of mandatory sharing was something else, and right now it is to serve the content staffed Doordarshan and its various channels. So from start, I want to know this, like, where do private leagues come in? I mean, you're going strong, there is popularity, there is TRP, there are ratings, and we saw in the case of IPL that there was a lot of back and forth, there were proposals being prepared. Do these games, in your opinion, form the so-called nationally important game? Do they make it in that section?
I think comes back to the same question that we were talking about earlier and what Lovely touched upon briefly, is what is nationally important. I think you may call it ambiguous, but I'm not sure. I think there is intelligible criteria that can be identified. Without intelligible criteria, I think the statute fails. So therefore, it's very important that we devise a set of intelligible criteria by which that ambiguity is clear, because otherwise it will always be subject to vagaries and whims and fancies essentially of people. The question is, what is nationally important? To my mind, it has to have an element of national sentiment, national pride. It has to be India performing at an international level. It cannot be equated to something that is popular. Popularity essentially would then translate into a situation where virtually every event that gains some kind of popularity, and remember there's a healthy tension here between public interest on the one side and the investment that the sport demands on the other side. The investment largely comes from sports broadcasting. And if you make Prasar Bharati or say DD Free Dish in this case a viable alternative for consumers to consume sports content on, you're defeating the sports model. You're defeating investment in sports. You're going to take people out. So therefore, the importance of defining what is nationally important can't be undermined at all. If you use popularity as the metric, you're going to completely kill the business of sports itself, the industry itself. You're going to make Prasar Bharati a viable alternative for people to actually go and consume content. I don't think that's the intent. The intent is to provide access to a set of events which are nationally important. It's important that we use the right lens and the right framework to arrive at these parameters. Otherwise, essentially, you're going to see investment in sports, especially the leagues that you're talking about, actually start to dry up then.
I think everyone wants to touch on this subject first, and so let's start. How do we redefine this term? Do we go by what European Union has? Do we go by the highlights of it?
Sorry, let me just add to what I think we briefly touched on again. When it comes to Australia, all that the anti-siphoning law requires is that the free-to-air broadcasters have an exclusive window of opportunity in which they're able to acquire the rights at fair price. Assuming that the free-to-air broadcasters don't acquire the rights at fair price, within that window it's open then to the pay TV operators to go and acquire. That's the anti-siphoning law. There is no equivalent, there's no equivalent to our mandatory sharing act in the global balance. If you look at the set of events also which are notified as being of national importance, you'll see a stark difference between what is notified in Australia, EU, UK, wherever else you may, the US, compared to what is done here. I mean, why should, as an example, just off the top of my head, why should hockey only the World Cup or the Champions Trophy in hockey essentially be events of national importance when all bilaterals of India, ODI, T20 actually be notified as events of national importance because they take place about, I think, 100 days a year we're playing cricket, approximately. You're essentially looking at then using popularity when it comes to one particular sport and using some other metric when it comes to other sports. To To my mind, popularity cannot be a criteria when it comes to national importance. And on a global scale also, there is no parallel on that level.
But even if government is notifying these sports, it comes back to Doordarshan on whether they want to show it or not. So who is the judge of whether it's government who's taking the decision that this sport is nationally important, it needs to be shown to a wider set of audiences, and then it comes back to Doordarshan whether they want to show it or not.
Sorry, I'm going to pass the mic to other people, but
yeah, no,
just hold on one second. Before I do, I'm going to pass it on. Hold on 1 second. So, one is, I think you touched on whether it's a choice that Prasar Bharati has to show the event. To my understanding, limited understanding, I don't think that's a choice. If there is a mandate which compulsory acquires someone's property, it better be used for that purpose. Otherwise, that mandate is not being fulfilled and you're undermining the entire act itself. So if it's Prasar Bharati's choice as to whether to show it live or not, or for that matter, not show it at all, that's a problem. That to my mind then actually lifts the mandate and should result in lifting the mandate. Sorry, pass it on.
Yeah, I'll come back to you much later then.
No, I think I quite agree with this position. The concept of sharing doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It's anti-siphoning. The concept of anti-siphoning is the cornering of very powerful intellectual assets, and there's a window of opportunity for the public broadcaster to acquire it or free-to-air broadcast. In fact, in most of these countries, it's about free-to-air. In some countries, it's not even necessarily free-to-air. It's about splitting the rights between the thing. There's no concept of national importance built in there. It's about anti-siphoning of powerful assets which can be misused for price gouging, which is basically the concept from which this whole anti-siphoning came about. Interestingly, I was in the room when this list of nationally important events was drawn up way back in 2007. And I remember that meeting in the ministry where Prasad Bharati was basically picking and choosing what he wanted, right? So it wasn't some very recent committee which this was done in about 5 minutes flat, where Mr. K. S. Sharma was asked by Mr. S. K. Arora, what do you want? And he's saying, I want this, I want this. And that list is continued till this day. As I said, there was a Indira Gandhi Gold Cup which has not been held since 2003 and it was re-notified in 2016 as an event of national importance. so that's really where it is.
My question is to Sidharth, is it within the right of Prasar Bharati not to show these events which have already been notified and which are there in the list, taking care of their own profits and losses?
See, as per the Act, once the events have been notified, they were obliged to show. The test matches, they only notified some India-Pakistan series and subsequently did not. But if a proper action in a writ would have been brought in, maybe a court would have considered that. But yes, they have been very selective in what they intend to show. On the question, if you asked that how do we determine what is the event of national importance, there are no guidelines or yardstick. But what one should not lose sight of the fact is that sport itself is sui generis. The broadcasting is sport. You can't implement the section in a manner where you completely appropriate a private league and say that I'll show it on Doordarshan 1 or a DD Sports channel because now I have a 24-hour dedicated sports channel, so I'll utilize section 3 to acquire all private leagues which are going on. While under the saying that it is very popular and people want to have access and people who do not otherwise have access should have access to these events, what it would result is driving away all the private broadcasters. These leagues have now come up only because private investment has come into it. So the exercise of that discretion which is vesting with the central government or Prasar Bharati in terms of section 3 and section 5 which notifies whatever other sporting events on it should not be wholly disproportionate to the purpose for which the section was enacted. You can't now enact, say, have 90 matches of IPL, I want to notify as event of national importance. Then that is the end of the great investment you are seeing in IPL. It's a private event, it's an entertainment. So that a Kabaddi league today, Prasar Bharati had every opportunity to invest in Kabaddi and make it what it is today. They never did it. So now once it has achieved an audience to now say that it has become an event of national importance and I exercise my rights under section 3. I mean, this will completely take away all the investment and how long would the broadcasters continue to support? If this, like I said, the situation was my content competes with my content on Prasar Bharati's channel. How would I compete with that? How will I survive in a situation like that? So it can't be completely diverse, disproportionate from the purpose and object for which the act was created. So I think that has to be kept in mind every time the government exercises its discretion to notify an event.
Building on that, you said like a private broadcaster's content is competing with the same content. Going back to 2017's judgment, how was it implemented on ground? I remember you had to go back to the court.
Yes. So it's an interesting question that once the judgment was on 22nd August last year, Supreme Court had pronounced the judgment, and immediately thereafter there was a cricket series going on, were to commence, and the question arose that how is this judgment going to be implemented? Is Prasar Bharati going to denotify the events, or what is to be done? Prasar Bharati did not do anything. So sport broadcaster again went back to Delhi High Court, armed with the Supreme Court judgment, and they said that in light of the judgment, private distribution platforms like Tata Sky, Dish TV and Hathways be restrained from telecasting or showing the cricket match on their platform. And Delhi High Court passed a detailed judgment after hearing, they were on caveats, they were heard. And by virtue of which, the duration during which the match is telecast now on a private distribution platform, you would notice that the match is available on Star Sports. The screen for the duration of the match is blanked out. The DD1 screen on private distribution platform for that duration is blanked out, and the match is not available on private distribution platforms. And the other thing which I want to say that the other purpose of the Sports Act was the match is available free of cost to people who don't have means or who don't want to spend. It is entirely possible even today for a person who otherwise has access, should he chooses or should he wants to have access at free of cost, to simply switch on and have an additional DD dish, and they can still have access to free of cost. So that's why I maintain the Act in its present form after the Supreme Court judgment is balancing rights of private broadcasters and the public perfectly fine. So we were fearing that there may be some amendment or something considering Prasar Bharati had implemented it in a particular manner and it thought that it has lost out on it, but thankfully some better sense has prevailed and we've not seen that. So.
Two questions after that. I want to come to Mr. Venkatesh because he has spearheaded a DTH company. Did this judgment invite a lot of consumer feedback and complaints on why Doordarshan was not telecasting the matches? What was the number back then?
I had left the DTH company by the time the judgment came. But I think it's a fair point which is being made here that actually the platforms and the cable networks are misusing this statute basically to the extent that because it was available on a free-to-air network like Doordarshan, it was possible for the distribution platforms to access that content for free when that was not the intent. The idea was to give access to the others. So I think the Supreme Court judgment has corrected that in large measure. So it's good.
Supreme Court judgment says that it can only happen on terrestrial or on free dish. I know the numbers of free dish, but I don't know the numbers of terrestrial. So who are these people who are going to be benefited with mandatory sharing now that cable is all over? According to the government, we have switched off analog completely. How relevant is this law still giving access to these wider range of audiences when we ourselves as law establish that cable is everywhere?
Yeah, so I think at the time that the Act came into being, which was 2007, you had approximately 50 odd million or maybe even more, which were dependent on terrestrial. I think in today's case, let's not forget, the Act spoke about two things, one terrestrial and two DTTH, which is free dish. Today you have a sizable population on free dish, even though the terrestrial numbers may have gone down significantly. Potentially, and I don't know, thinking off the top of my head, it's an up conversion by the terrestrial base to free dish. I don't know. I mean, Venki will know better. About 40 million. So you see the base being the same. So I don't think there is a question to revisit, and again, personally speaking, revisit whether the Mandatory Sharing Act itself should sustain it's relevant. There are a set of people who don't have access. Here is a statute which provides access. I think the lens to be applied in terms of when it should be given is what is the nature of those events which are shared. And, sporadic ad hoc decisions which in the recent past were a fair few. For example, I'll give one more ad hoc example is all sports broadcasters today who actually go and share their live signals are required to run a ticker on their cable and satellite channels which go to that set of audience which is not the intended beneficiaries of the statute, to say that you can go and consume this match or this event for free on terrestrial or DDDTH. It's an absurdity. You're essentially asking, or rather mandating and acquiring compulsory certain content or property from a broadcaster, having him to actually promote free consumption of that same event on Doordarshan. I mean, it's, to my mind, goes against the judgment of the Supreme Court, goes against the statute itself, and I mean, the entire point of providing access is lost. It's no longer about access then.
Can we put a figure of the financial benefit on this judgment? For a private broadcaster?
Not necessarily. I think it's yet to be seen. And if the list of sporting events of national importance keeps growing, then I don't think it's going to be very much.
Lovely. Same question we were discussing before this, the legal relevance of it. Now that terrestrial is down, we know we have free dish still, but in light of the foreign regulations, where do we stand?
So first thing is, if we kind of concede to the fact that we have, and it's a fact, that we have a large number of populists who would really want free access, right? First, we agree on that yes, we have that kind of a populace, we need to cater to their interest. The second thing is, then do we need to cut down on the number of households who have access? So do we do that empirical survey that you have access? I mean, you can afford a paid channel, and and therefore you need not be given that access, right? Then we work out the modalities of to which extent should Prasar Bharati be allowed to share that mandatory sharing and use that feed to provide access to people who don't have access. Otherwise, with the current scenario, it is, sorry to say this, but I think we are harping on the same point again and again since the morning, that is essentially subsidizing Prasar Bharati and not catering to the interest of people who are deprived of access.
So let's start the discussion from you only. How do we change this? How do we revisit this and redefine the terms?
I think we need to, getting inspired by what the Supreme Court did in 2017, we need to interpret the law, and it is not for us. We as lawyers or law faculties or law teachers or researchers can only harp on this point. But just for Prasar Bharati, the regulator, that is where the conflict of interest comes in. They try to be the regulator and they try to be the executor, and they try to benefit out of it. So we need to have, there's this large demand, and that was the aspiration. We need to have an independent regulatory body on this whole broadcasting, which has never occurred till date. So unless that happens, how do you, it's not going to materialize. Sorry to say this, but it's not going to materialize, and they are not going to cut down on the way they are currently doing the thing, which is like getting free riding on the hard work of the private broadcaster, and you've seen the extent to which you have to keep a clean feed. So it means that you have to do all the hard work, you give it to them free, and on top of it, you also have this to share the profits and all. So it is really hard luck for the private broadcaster and all win-win all the way for the Prasar Bharati till we have an independent broadcasting regulator.
Sidharth, you want to add on that?
Since we are talking of revisiting the mandatory sharing section 3, the thing which we should consider revisiting is the interpretation which came in an earlier judgment of the Supreme Court on section 3, because section 3 mandates that the private broadcaster has to share the signal of a sporting event of national importance without its advertisements. The purpose was that during the breaks, after an over, all of those advertisements which generally accrue to a broadcaster would accrue to Prasar Bharati, and there is a mechanism how the revenue has to be shared. Prasar Bharati took a cassette view in the matter and said that even the logo which is embossed on the scorecard, which are usually the event sponsors, even that amounts to advertisement, and you, Mr. Private Broadcaster, who is already obliged under an expropriatory section to share with me, you also ensure that the event organizer, ICC, removes that LG logo which comes along with the scorecard when sharing your feed with me. It was an extraordinary demand. The case of the broadcaster was that is not my advertisers. Those are the advertisers for the event sponsors who have purchased global rights. The purpose of that LG logo on that scorecard was that wherever this feed goes throughout the world, the LG has paid to get that prominence. But Prasar Bharati took the view that this is commercial exploitation and you either have to share 25% of the revenue with me, then 25% of the non-existent revenue which I never got. I have to share that 25% of the revenue with Prasar Bharati. There was a threat that there will be a blackout of the event. For cricket, considering what power we command in cricket and we manage at an additional cost, the broadcaster managed to procure a separate feed. So we were simultaneously sharing not my feed, two feeds. One which was having that LG logo and coming on private broadcaster, and another which was a separately procured feed which was going to Prasar Bharati. Supreme Court, in view of the strong opposition put by Prasar Bharati, went for a literal interpretation of the section and held that considering the law of the land it has to be without advertisement. This is advertisement. It does not matter to us whether it's an advertisement of an event organizer or of a broadcaster. They came to a conclusion that that it has to be without advertisements. Any advertisement that LG logo can't be there. And if it is there, then revenue sharing has to happen. Now, so far for cricket, we have been able to manage it. I do not know how Prasar Bharati would manage if it were to ask the FIFA World Cup broadcaster to ensure that the Nike logo has to be removed. Otherwise, nobody in India will be able to watch the match.
The one on the football.
The one, it can potentially go to people. People cannot wear the dresses having any logos. So it can. I mean, this is a cusset view. This is a section which was brought in to grant access. An interpretation is being made so as to deprive everybody of the access. If FIFA broadcaster in India is unable to convince FIFA to give a clean feed without that Nike logo, we could potentially have a blackout of the entire event by virtue of a law which was to give access of the event. That is what Prasar Bharati is doing.
From you two, let's have a quick wrap of, on two things, like as a leading broadcaster and as a broadcaster which is less than a year old, what do you want the law to be, how we can achieve, how we can move towards a fairer law?
Okay, no, first off, I'm not speaking on behalf of the broadcaster, I'm speaking personally. But essentially, to my mind, one, nationally important, intelligible criteria, very important to define. To my mind, just off the top of my head, it has to be India competing at an international level, akin to a World Cup, akin to Indian participation at the Olympics, at the Asian Games, where there's an element of national pride, national sentiment, not the 100-odd games that India plays through the year on a, almost virtually year-round basis, where it's become mostly just people following it as a matter of really following the sport itself, not as a matter of national sentiment or pride. And the second bit is things like where, we've been mandated to run tickers to essentially drive audiences to otherwise, I frankly, personally speaking, basis the 2017 Supreme Court judgment, I don't think we have a cause for complaint to say that there's no place for the act itself today.
I think in closing, the onus has to be shifted to the rights owners and how they transact rather than the broadcaster who buys the rights, because that's the way it's done globally. The broadcaster who buys the right today in India becomes the experimental animal. Whereas if there's issues about providing access, then let whoever is the rights holder, whether it's a FIFA or ICC or whatever, provide a window for the public broadcasters to pay and buy the rights. If he doesn't pay and buy the rights, then that's fine. I mean, there's a commercial consideration. If they want to provide public service, then they have to pay that commercial consideration, not take it off the back of a private broadcaster.
All right, thank you each one of you. Let's give a huge round of applause for this fantastic lecture. Do we have any questions? We can take a couple of questions maybe.
Well, thank you for very insightful views. I had a couple of questions. One is there a scope for exercise of judicial review in the statute if tomorrow IPL is notified? Do you think there is sufficient basis on which the court can strike down such a inclusion of IPL? And secondly, if we change the revenue sharing formula, do you think that would be an adequate safeguard for broadcasters? If we change it to the benefit of broadcasters and maybe have Prasar Bharati have a very minimal revenue, would you think that would take care of the interests of the private broadcasters?
Okay, I'll start with the second one. And I'm sorry, any of you guys have views, please. But, so sorry. But starting with the second one and changing the compensation formula. So if we are all clear that it's like land acquisition, I think we're talking about fair compensation. What does fair compensation translate into? You're talking about, let's take the IPL as a case. 16,000 odd crores being agreed to be paid to the BCCI for IPL rights. Assume that you take the audience numbers that today exist on free dish and those on terrestrial. Do you think 75% of the advertising revenue that comes from showing the IPL on Prasar Bharati is going to compensate? I wouldn't think so. If you just use the metrics of how much is the television audience across in terms of cable and satellite, what say Star has agreed to pay for it, and what is coming through Prasar Bharati in terms of free dish, say 40 odd million, would Prasar Bharati, or for that matter, it's not even Prasar Bharati, it's the tax-paying citizen of this country, would they actually be able to pay for that particular, rights fee as fair compensation? I would think not. Sorry, the first question, could you remind me what your first question was?
Is there scope for judicial review?
Judicial review. To my mind, no question. I think in terms of national, again, personally speaking, to my mind, no question. The absence of intelligible criteria, to my mind, has already made that statute fragile. And the longer it sustains without intelligible criteria, the longer there's chances of it continuing to be fragile, especially on the back of random odd occurrences where for 10 years the IPL is not nationally important, but suddenly in the 11th year turns out to be nationally important.
And IPL may be popular, but we don't know whether it's an event of national importance, considering players from various jurisdictions come and represent franchisees, and it are all franchise owners. And in that, whether it will qualify as an event of national importance or it is a pure entertainment, like many people simply believe it is that 120 minutes of pure entertainment, whether that should be utilized to notify 90 matches of IPL. So yes, it is susceptible to a judicial review, and we'll be optimistic of our chances if that happen, but we don't want to have that thought. Two, that section, the revenue sharing which you asked, the section 3 in its present form is also double expropriatory. Not only is it taking away my property, the revenue which it is giving is only 75-25% to make up for the ads which I have lost. I've already lost my subscription fee if this act was not there. Otherwise, people will have to subscribe to it. So that they do not do. So when I say it's double expropriatory, it is impacting my revenue in terms of subscription fee and also impacting my advertisement revenue. The advertisement revenue which otherwise the broadcaster would get for an exclusive event is much more than revenue which you will get when you are sharing an event with Doordarshan where the advertisement rates are far less. So it is double expropriatory. So the revenue sharing model there does not in any way compensate for the investment that goes into the acquisition of the rights.
I think we'll have to close here. We are out of time.
Sorry, just one thing, last bit. In terms of, again, coming back to the nationally important bit, the question is if every event starts becoming nationally important and is notified, you're going to have a situation where Prasar Bharati becomes a viable alternative to any private broadcaster. The natural consequence of that is that private broadcasters who are in it, willing to invest with a potential long-term plan in mind, are going to stop.
The final point, Saurav, is that our Supreme Court of India has said that watching cricket is in public interest. So you decide what would be the state.
Till last year, that was just men's cricket. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Panelists. Ready to make it heavy on stage? We will now be releasing our research report on sports broadcast regulation titled A Wider Spectrum. To release the report, I'd like to invite first Justice Mukul Mudgal on stage. Mr. Chintamani Rao. Mr. R.C. Venkatesh. Mr. Chaitanya Diwan. Mr. Mihir Rale. And finally, Mr. Nandan Kamal.